Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome back to Squeeze Fan TV, the world's only daily Squeeze vlog. And today, I thought we'd do a bit of a fun topic. I'm going to be talking about when Squeeze go beyond, when Squeeze step outside their expected sphere of musical content or style and try to do something different. This is a side to the band that critics often never really acknowledged, the experimental side of Squeeze. I think in Glenn's case it was something that was always very important to him. He'd grown up listening to experimental music. He was a big fan of Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, that kind of thing. He was more of an experimentalist, I think, than Chris would like him to have been. Chris, I think, wanted Squeeze more to be a bit more of a basic rock and roll band. And I know it led to certain tensions in the studio sometimes when Glenn insisted on going beyond the Squeeze formula and trying to do things in a different way, experiment. Didn't always work. I've got, I think, 10 or 11 examples here. Some of them work, some of them don't, but I think it's a commendable thing. That Glenn always did want to try and push the boat out a bit and take Squeeze's sound somewhere else. The great sort of most famous example of it is probably Tempted and Labelled with Love, which actually were singles and are quite well-known songs. Tempted obviously is a blue-eyed soul track sung by Paul Carrack, and Labelled with Love is a country song. And I guess, both of those songs are on the 45s and Under album, so they are very well known. But they're not experimental tracks as such. They're just songs that are done in a particular style that Squeeze were not particularly known for. So the ones I've tried to highlight here are maybe a bit more like proper experimental. Not all of them. There's one or two which are maybe a little bit borderline. Anyway, see what you think, and I'm not going to say too much about the songs because obviously at some point I'll be doing a review, a Song of the Day entry on each of them, so I don't want to spend too long on any of them, but let's just whiz through these. So from the first album, obviously, Squeeze, this was the album that John Cale got his dirty mitts on, and he made the band dump all their songs and he got them to record or just write new ones in the studio. So there are a few on here that I could have picked. I think... I'll just mention all of them, essentially. So you've got the instrumental Wild Sewerage Tickles Brazil, which features the sound of a canteen girl screaming, pretending that she's being set upon, I think, by a baying mob. Clearly nothing like Squeeze, a strange instrumental track. I think in my book I said it sounded like the Shadows on Bad Acid. And then on side two, you've got The Call, which is a very strange, abrasive song, quite heavy, quite post-punk, and Hesitation, Rule Britannia, which the band essentially just jammed in the studio. John Cale, I think, would shout out the chord changes and they would just, follow along with what he was saying, which is how he made some of his records as well. Very experimental. I don't think it was a direction that they were ever going to pursue afterwards, but that's another story. Now we skip ahead now. I couldn't really see anything on Cool for Cats or on Argy Bargy really that you could think of as being experimental. I think the next time they sort of really did it was on East Side Story, and that was largely thanks, I think, to Elvis Costello wanting them to explore some new areas. So apart from the two tracks that I've already mentioned, there's a couple of what I consider to be, there's one really strong example on here of experimental music, and that would be on side one, There's No Tomorrow, which to my ears sounds like maybe a 1966 Beatles song. It's got that kind of acid-drenched, like Surgic kind of feel. When I was a kid, when I was growing up, I never used to like this song very much, but it's grown on me over the years. I think it's quite inventive. I quite like it. And I suppose F-Hole on here too is quite experimental. It's a string-led song, the Del Newman string arrangement, and it's got a sort of interesting jerky rhythm from Gilson. I think that is definitely a bit of an experimental song. Sweet from a Stranger, Glenn arguably went a couple of steps too far. I think he decided that Squeeze needed to be a bit more cutting edge, a bit more experimental. So he had a few interesting things happening on this record. Clearly you had When the Hangover Strikes, which was a nod to Frank Sinatra and Nelson Riddle. Not exactly experimental though. The track I've picked from here actually is The Very First Dance, which is the second to last song, which I really like. I think it's underrated. I know in Song by Song, Chris has got no time for this song at all, but I think it's quite interesting. It sounds like an early example of vocal sampling. I don't think it is vocal samples. I think all the bits are, sung in live, but it sounds like that. And there's a really interesting fade out with all this strange saloon bar piano going on. More like a sound collage, really. I just think a really interesting sound. Difford and Tilbrook was an experimental album, I think, in the sense that they were voyaging further into that blue-eyed soul. But then at the end of the record, you had The Apple Tree, which I think is a fantastic piece of music. Nothing like anything they'd done before. Very strange, very unnerving, and a sort of unexpected highlight of the album, really. Doesn't quite fit with the rest of the album, but certainly a really interesting song. On Ridiculous, the album that showed them exploring all kinds of directions, you'll notice that I've skipped a few albums here. So, I mean, on Cozy Fan Tutti Frutti, you've got the big overblown production. It's not exactly experimentalism. Babylon and On, I think, is a very straightforward album. Frank is a very straightforward album. Play moves very firmly into that adult contemporary feel, but I think without doing anything particularly experimental. Same for Some Fantastic Place. On this record, right at the end, you've got the track Fingertips, which apparently was almost an accident in the studio, really. I think Chris says in Song by Song that it just popped out one day. They thought that the recording session was finished, and then this song just popped out at the end, and Chris was very excited by the song. It was quite unsqueeze-like, quite trip-hoppy almost. And I think Chris, reading between the lines, Chris thought that maybe it was going to set a new direction for the band, and I think he was possibly quite disappointed on the next album when that wasn't the case. Interestingly, because like I said before, Chris, in the earlier days, Chris was never into the experimental side of things, and he wanted things kept very straightforward. On Domino, which was a very rushed album, and one that Chris didn't really like at all, although I think he's come round to it in more recent times. You've got the track Short Break at the end, which has got a bit of a spoken word thing going on, and again, it's got a bit of a post-punk kind of feel to it. Not sure what I think of that one. Might have to get to that one in due course when we do Song of the Day. And then finally, I thought I'd show this album. Now, I've not really talked about the last two Squeeze albums very much, and I'll explain about that as we get further into these videos. I don't think there's anything too experimental on here, but I guess the big departure on this album was Glenn writing the lyrics for some of the songs, and I think a track like A&E, the third song on side one, is definitely Squeeze stepping into uncharted waters, really, trying to do political songwriting. I suspect with Glenn writing the lyrics, personally, I don't think it works at all. I think the song is a bit of a clunker. But I guess you could describe it at a push as Squeeze pushing back the envelope, trying to do something different. I'm not really sure it works, really, but anyway, there we go. I'm sure there are some other examples. I'm just thinking now, even on Cool for Cats, you've got a song like The Knack, which is quite experimental in its way. It's almost got a kind of film noir ambience to it. I think the experimental side of Squeeze was always there, bubbling under, and occasionally it would break out and it would become more noticeable. I think those tracks are in general to be cherished. I think they're sort of interesting, and I think it's good that Glenn decided to try exploring sometimes rather than sticking to the formula. Anyway, enough of a ramble. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll be glad to read your suggestions for other experimental tracks which took Squeeze beyond. And thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.